It would seem that the species would be an important part of any theory of evolution. Darwin titled his book On the Origin of Species, after all. How species come to be also was Alfred Russel Wallace's concern. The word species is ubiquitous. In biology courses like botany and zoology, for example, learning about species is virtually all you do. If you have an outdoor hobby, like bird watching, you carry with you field guides with helpful diagrams and paintings to help you distinguish one species from another. We estimate that we share the planet with about 2 million species of animals, plants, fungi, and bacteria. And we're told, with ominous undertones, that so many species are going extinct each day that we are in the midst of an ongoing extinction crisis. We even have an Endangered Species Act. It's written down in law. So you would think that we would have a very good idea of what a species is, but you would be wrong. You don't have to dig very deeply into the taxonomy and systematics literature, the sciences of what species are, to see that there's real confusion there. And this seems odd. Given its importance, there should be one, and only one, species concept. Yet, by one recent account, there's not just one species concept, there are 22 of them. And by another account, there are 26. Why? At root, the species concept is a means to make sense of the living world. There's nothing wrong with that. We do it all the time. Of course, there are a lot of different ways people try to do that. And that's the short answer to the question of why there are a lot of different species concepts. There are lots of ways that people try to make sense of the living world. What all species concepts have in common, however, is the organization of the living world into categories, discrete bins where we can put similar things. We've been doing this ever since Aristotle, and probably much longer, in fact. Aristotle just happened to write down a set of formal criteria, 4 of them actually. One criterion was whether a creature had blood. According to Aristotle, some animals, like birds, mammals, snakes, and fish, had blood, while others, like insects, mollusks, and crustaceans, supposedly lacked blood. Another criterion was how many legs an animal had. Did they have 2 legs, like humans or birds? Or 4 legs, like most mammals and lizards? Or 6 legs, like insects? Or many legs, like crustaceans or squids? Or no legs, like snails, sharks, snakes, or whales? Aristotle's third criterion centered on the organism's composition, namely how a creature was made up from the 4 essences of hot, cold, wet, or dry. And we looked at this in an earlier episode. And finally, his 4th criterion was the nature of the soul animating the creature, its anima. Aristotle designated 3 types of souls: the vegetative, the sensitive, and the rational. Plants had only a vegetative soul. Nearly all animals had both a vegetative soul and a sensitive soul, and only humans had all 3. Now, very little of this makes sense to us today. For example, we know that crustaceans and mollusks do have blood. Their blood is just different from ours. It's blue, and it's circulated around the body differently from vertebrates like ourselves. Aristotle's scheme also lumped in whales with snakes because neither have legs. That doesn't make any sense. And of course, the nature of living things' souls doesn't even enter into our modern conceptions of life. It's too vitalist and spooky. But even if Aristotle's scheme doesn't make sense to us, it did make sense to Aristotle, and that underscores the basic problem. Aristotle had his reasons, we have ours. And how do we decide which way is the correct way to organize the living world? Let's put that question into historical and philosophical context. From medieval times to the Enlightenment, how we thought about the living world came under the rubric of natural history, or natural philosophy. The Socratic philosophers Plato and Aristotle were the dominating influences here. We've designated these philosophers as purposeful philosophers. There was a purpose in nature, as opposed to the purposeless world of the atomists. Even though there was considerable overlap between Plato and Aristotle, there were significant points of difference. And medieval philosophy was rife with disputes over fine points of doctrine between the Platonists and the Aristotelians. And this applied as much to disputes over the nature of the living world as it did to the nature of God. Which underscores an important thing to understand about medieval natural history. It was not motivated by a scientific approach of asking nature to tell us something about itself. Rather, nature was queried to tell us something about philosophy. As a result, medieval classification schemes were as diverse as views on, say, the nature of God. As a result, there was a great deal of idiosyncrasy to these debates. Every philosopher brought individually defined points of difference and similarity to the table, and each philosopher was convinced that his interpretations were superior to those of other philosophers. And generally, kinds of organisms were given long and descriptive Latin names that emphasized subtle points of difference from philosopher to philosopher. In short, medieval natural history produced no coherent way to think about living nature independently of some philosophical scheme. Living nature was not allowed to speak for itself, in other words. Which brings us to the Swedish naturalist Carl von Linné, better known by his Latinized name, Carolus Linnaeus. In conventional histories of biology, Linnaeus was the man who brought order to the chaos of contemporary natural history by finally allowing living nature to speak for itself. And he's also credited with laying the foundations for our modern concept of the species. Neither claim is entirely true. While Linnaeus did bring coherency to the organization of the living world, he also laid the groundwork for our current confusion over the species concept. We'll get to that a little bit later, but for now, let's look at how Linnaeus brought order out of chaos. Rather than the willy-nilly and ad hoc systems that had been built up over the centuries, Linnaeus asserted that nature was organized around a consistent set of increasingly inclusive hierarchical ranks. His most inclusive category was the class. Contained within classes were several subsidiary and ever more exclusive categories. Within classes could be several orders. Within orders, there could be several genera, and within genera, there could be several species. A certain natural orderliness emerges from this scheme because no organism can simultaneously inhabit more than one category. An organism could not, for example, be more than one species. These were Linnaeus's own categories, and by convention, these categories have since increased in number. Two more inclusive categories of kingdom and phylum had been added above Linnaeus's rank of class, and the intermediate category of family was sandwiched between order and genus. Let's use the honeybee to illustrate how the Linnaean system works. These insects occupy the kingdom Animalia. Plants, in contrast, occupy their own kingdom, the Plantae. Nested within the animal kingdom is the phylum category. The honeybees are in the arthropod phylum. Vertebrates are in another phylum, the Chordata. Honeybees occupy the class Insecta. The insects are one of several classes of arthropods. Crabs are also arthropods, but they occupy their own class, the Crustacea. Within the insects are several more exclusive orders referenced by the characteristics of their wings. The honeybee's order is Hymenoptera, or membrane wings. Flies occupy another insect order, the Diptera, or two wings. Within the Hymenoptera, the honeybees belong to their own family, the Apidae. Creatures like wasps are also Hymenoptera, but these are in a different family, the Vespidae. Within the Apidae family, honeybees are classified into the genus Apis. Bumblebees are also in the Apidae, but their genus is Bombus. And the honeybees are in their own species, Mellifera. There are other species of Apis, like the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. Here's the genius of the Linnaean scheme. At every level, honeybees fit into one and only one category, right down to the most exclusive category of the species. If the honeybee occupies one category, it is never to be found simultaneously in another category. And this is true all the way down from kingdom to species. Linnaeus also formalized how species are named. Prior to Linnaeus, species were identified by long, descriptive Latin phrases with no rules of nomenclature. Linnaeus tidied all that up with a standardized way to name species using two names, binomial nomenclature as it's formally called. The species name for honeybees, for example, consists of the generic name, capitalized, combined with the species name, all in lowercase. Every other species has its own binomial. We are Homo sapiens, for example. These Linnaean innovations were certainly helpful, but ranked hierarchies and binomial nomenclature were really just bookkeeping. Nice, yes. Useful, without doubt, but hardly exciting. What's more important was Linnaeus's methodological innovation. He had a definitive answer to the question, what is the proper way to describe a species? To frame the question, let's take, say, a plant. What species is it? One could describe the plant species using characters like the shapes of the leaves, where they branch from the stems, and so forth. But that approach runs immediately into a problem of variability. Two leaves might come from the same species, or even from the same individual plant, but their shapes might differ based upon maturity, environmental conditions, and so forth. And that variability can wreak havoc on any classification scheme based upon leaf shape. Linnaeus got around this problem by looking for points that all individuals and generations of a species held in common. And for Linnaeus, the logical choke point was the reproductive parts of the plant, the flowers. So Linnaeus built a classification scheme for the plants that was organized around the number of anthers in the flower. Anthers are the male part of the flower, let's remember. So, for example, flowers with one anther comprised Linnaeus's class Monandria. Flowers with two anthers were the Diandria. Flowers with three anthers comprised the class Triandria, while the flowers with four made up the class Tetrandria, and so forth, up to flowers with 13 or more anthers. All that was orderly, neat, and sensible. But I said earlier that Linnaeus also laid the ground for the future chaos about the species. Let's return to that with that philosophical flow diagram again. Notice how Linnaeus is placed in one of the purposeful intellectual traditions of biology. This underscores an important point about the Linnaean species concept. It did not liberate the concept of the species from the purposeful philosophical traditions of natural history. Just like all his predecessors, Linnaeus developed his concept of the species to make a philosophical point. And Linnaeus' species concept was a thoroughly Platonic concept, which made the species a reflection of the rational mind of the Platonic God. The proper aim of studying nature for Linnaeus was therefore to uncover the rational scheme in the mind of God. To Linnaeus, understanding how the living world was organized would open a window on God's mind. And God, being a rational being, would have organized the living world into orderly and logical categories that could be apprehended by rational creatures like ourselves. Linnaeus's concept of the species was therefore an essentially Platonic species concept. That is to say, species were the Platonic ideals that reflected the mind of the Creator. The genus was the closest expression of that ideal, and species were variations on that theme. What seemed so sensible to Linnaeus, however, was actually the source of the ensuing confusion over the nature of the species. Which brings us to Charles Darwin. He did not title his book The Theory of Evolution, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. He titled it, remember, On the Origin of Species. To Darwin, Wallace, and many other naturalists of the mid-19th century, definitions of species were beginning to look arbitrary and capricious. No wonder there. The Linnaean system was philosophically at odds with the emerging evolutionary ideas of Darwin and Wallace. Why? Well, let's illustrate. The Linnaean system was categorical. The genus was one categorical box, and nested within that were the categorical boxes of the species, four in this illustration labeled A, B, C, and D. Species reflected ideal forms, and ideal forms fit neatly into these categories. Yet species in nature did not seem so categorical. Both Darwin and Wallace were keenly aware of this. Within a supposedly well-defined species, there could be considerable variation in form. And this meant that there was sometimes considerable overlap between species, making it difficult to put particular individuals into one species category or another. Where did one species leave off and the other begin? Or was there an entirely new species lurking in that zone of overlap? Also, precisely where should one draw the line between one species and another? In a living world seemingly dominated by variation, species were coming to look less and less categorical. And because variation was coming to play a larger and larger role in the thinking of both Darwin and Wallace, the Linnaean system of genus and species was coming to look ever more antiquated and incompatible with living nature. And it's from this irreconcilable conflict that the ongoing confusion over the nature of the species has streamed. The basic question is this: is the species a category of living nature? Or is the species the product of an evolutionary process? There's a fundamental tension between these two conceptions of the species. Variation, for example, is the enemy of the categorical species. For an evolutionary species, in contrast, variation is central. Evolution won't work without variation. Natural selection depends on variation. How to reconcile the irreconcilable, then? According to this man, Ernst Mayr, reconciliation will come by formulating a new concept of the species, a biological as opposed to a Platonic species concept. Mayr defined the biological species as a reproductive community, a group of individuals who breed and exchange genes with one another. In other words, a species is a gene pool. To illustrate, let's take two of the hypothetical species we just introduced. I symbolized species A as a five-pointed star, and let's say there's variation in this form, what we presently call phenotypes. The points may be shallow, for example, or the points may be deep. All are five-pointed stars nevertheless. They comprise a common form around which individuals may vary. Mayr drew his concept of a reproductive community directly from the genetic theory of natural selection, and this defines both species and evolution as problems of population genetics. The reproductive community that constitutes species A consists of a gene pool populated by different genomic alleles. The different phenotypes of five-pointed stars come from these genes combining in different ways. The variation in phenotypes reflects gene variation, in other words. Okay, let's introduce species D, which I symbolized with an eight-pointed star. This species also comprises various phenotypes of eight-pointed stars. Species D forms its own reproductive community consisting of a gene pool populated with various genome alleles from which emerge the different phenotypes of species D. The biological species is therefore defined by limits to how genes are exchanged. In species A, genes are exchanged between the reproductive phenotypes and their gene pool, and similarly for species D. What makes A and D each species is a barrier between exchange of genes between the two gene pools. The barrier makes A and D each a reproductive community. Meyer's biological species concept, which was centered around the behavior of genes in populations, did not really settle the matter, unfortunately. To the contrary, the biological species spawned the proliferation of what has come to be those dozens of different species concepts, what we can call evolutionary species concepts. The evolutionary species concept is like the biological species concept, except that it adds the additional dimension of time to the idea of a reproductive community. The German biologist Willi Hennig was the founder of this line of thinking. He was influential enough to have a family of species concepts named after him. The so-called Hennigian species concept offers lots of interesting new questions to chew over. For example, what actually happens during species events? Is it a simple branching, as Darwin and Wallace originally proposed, or was it something else? What prompts a reproductive community to split into two to form two new species? Does the ancestor go extinct, or does it carry on somehow? One interesting question is how tightly a species concept should be tied to its evolutionary history, the so-called phylogenetic species concept. Believe it or not, this is one of the hotter disputes over the species concept. And just what are species anyway? Are they the same as lineages? What's the nature of the family tree of the lineage/species? And how does this relate to the definition of a species? Now, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of these debates. The debates are full of neologisms, fine points of definition, and nuance, and at times the debates are not at all civilized. In short, the debates over the species are almost theological in their complexity. If you want to dip a toe into this complexity, here's a good compilation of it. Good luck, because what you won't find in there is why there is no settled concept of the species. What I'd like to do here is to frame the question of the species in light of the alternative, that is to say, the non-Darwinian theories of evolution I've been laying out in this series. Let's return once again to our philosophical map of the history of biology. Modern species concepts, like the biological species or the evolutionary species, are derived from a neo-Darwinian concept of evolution. Now, I've argued elsewhere that neo-Darwinism lacks a coherent theory of life. And this means that neo-Darwinism cannot be a coherent theory for evolution. So, here's a question. How can we expect a coherent species concept to come from that incoherent foundation? Neo-Darwinism also comes from an entirely different philosophical tradition from that of taxonomy and systematics. Neo-Darwinism is an atomist philosophy of life. In contrast, Linnaeus's conception of the species was a reflection of Platonic idealism. Reconciling this concept of the species with a neo-Darwinist perspective on evolution, therefore, is like the old geometric problem of squaring the circle. It's impossible. No wonder there's confusion. Could it be, then, that it's time to scrap the entire concept of the species as the relic of Platonic idealism that it is? I think so, but what would take its place? Well, here's my suggestion. We start with a clear understanding of what evolution is. Darwinism has not provided that clarity. So let's frame the question in the context of the standing wave metaphor I developed earlier. An organism sits at a crest of low entropy in the environment. An adaptive boundary controls the flow of matter and energy into the organism, essentially importing low entropy on its way to its dissipation into heat. This is life, and this is adaptation. Evolution is adaptation through time, informed by memory. And by memory, I don't simply mean the narrow neo-Darwinian conception of memory tokens encoded in DNA. I'm talking about the active memory that shapes and informs adaptation. And both adaptation and memory have to include the extended organism idea, the mutual adaptation of organism and environment. In this model, evolutionary fitness is the persistence of a particular dynamic disequilibrium. Furthermore, adaptation is a continuous cognitive process. It reflects life's fundamental property of homeostasis, which imparts intentionality and purposefulness. The adaptive boundary interprets the environment and compares it against the organism's dynamic memory. Function, both internal and extended, is continually adjusted to sustain the persistent dynamic disequilibrium that is the organism. Okay, what does this model of adaptation and evolution have to say about the whole question of the species? For one thing, it reinterprets the biological species concept not in terms of population genetics, as Ernst Mayr did, but in the context of adaptive function. So, for example, where the biological species had been defined as a reproductive community persisting through time, we can now think of the species as an adaptive community that reflects similarity in adaptation, memory, and persistent orderliness. If species are adaptive communities, this allows a new interpretation of the question that motivated both Darwin and Wallace: where do new species come from? The standing wave metaphor allows us to ride the low entropy crest along in time. The low entropy crest is always changing shape through changes in physical conditions and being shaped as part of the extended organism. That is where variation comes from. If homeostasis applies to adaptive communities, as it does to individual organisms or populations of organisms, we should expect adaptive communities to also persist through time. The adaptive community should stay pretty similar through time as we ride along the crest of that standing wave. Speciation therefore becomes the formation of new adaptive communities, and this is driven by striving towards new cognitive interpretations of the world. This striving will lead to the emergence of entirely different cognitive interpretations of the world, informed by different sets of dynamic memory, new adaptive communities, new species. But are these actually species? At least in the sense of new adaptive communities being new categories of organisms? Can one even speak of such dynamic, continually changing, interpretive cognitive systems being categorical at all? In short, perhaps it's time to ditch entirely the concept of the species as a relic of Platonic idealism. That should make the confusion over species go away.